And our first speaker is Professor Ulrich Woitek. He's a professor at the University of Zurich for economic history. And he has a very comprehensive training at numerous universities in Europe. He studied in Munich. He was academic assistant there, then had experience in the UK in Glasgow, and he's in Zurich for numerous years. And I'm now more than happy that I can learn from you together with our audience. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks for coming. In the morning on the train, when I went through the slides, I realized that probably I should have chosen a different title, more something like Policy Choices During the Great Depression. But these policy choices, they were made in a certain intellectual environment, and the system debate is obviously part of this environment. And therefore, I will talk about the system debate as well, but maybe less prominently than the title promises, and I apologize for that. But let me give you an overview. An important question for sure is whether we learned something from the Great Depression. And if we look into these 4 bullet points here, giving you an overview on the main characteristics of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression is a long-lasting economic downturn in the 1930s. In an economy like the US, the unemployment rate climbed up to 25%, so that was serious. You could ask yourself about economic policy at the time, the role of economic policy at the time, and what you can see is, well, there is a lack of economic policy responses, or wrong economic policy responses, and they made things worse. The experience of the Depression was not just the birth did not just lead to the birth of macroeconomics, of modern macroeconomics, but it led also to changes, to important changes. First of all, in the response toolkit to a depression like this, and second, also in regulatory intervention in general. But what did not happen was that there was not a general switch to economic planning, away from market economy towards economic planning. That's not entirely true. As we know, there are economies like Germany, like Italy, which switched to a fascist corporatist system, or even in the USA. Think about measures like the National Industry Recovery Act put in place in 1933 that had planning elements to it, and it was actually declared unconstitutional in 1935. But I think with these qualifications, the last bullet point is also correct. Triggering the Great Depression was the stock market crash in 1929, but you see, shocks happen all the time. That is not really the important question. The important question is the system the shock hits, is it stable enough to cope with the shocks? And that was not the case in the 1920s. It was not the case, mainly because of the economic consequences of World War I. And there's some points you can make here. First of all, there's a structural problem. It was very difficult to switch the economies back to peacetime production. So there was a misallocation of resources, if you want, because of the war. The government fostered cartels, and it came to a growing inflexibility of wages and prices, so a reduction in flexibility of the economy. The financial sector was very vulnerable. That played an important role. And all these vulnerabilities you have to see also in the international context of a fragile international monetary system. The interval gold standard, we will talk about that in a second, did not really work as well as the gold standard before before World War I. Now, given all these new developments, so that's really different from the 19th century, the orthodox economic policy measures tailor-made for 19th century situation, they could not really cope with these new challenges. And we had a serious crisis in the 1920s, the hyperinflation and the Great Depression as a consequence of that. So economists at the time were engaged in a very fundamental debate. Some economists, I should say, were engaged in a very fundamental debate about the relative merits of centralization and economic planning. This debate was triggered by a paper by Ludwig von Mises in 1920, who pointed out that central planning cannot work because price signals are missing. Other contributions like Oscar Lange, who said, yes, we can mimic a tâtonnement process in a planned economy. Hayek saying, no, that will not work because the incentives of the planner are different from the incentives of individuals in a market economy. So there was a debate going on, and this debate was related to this empirical facts I just showed you about the vulnerabilities of the economic system in the 1920s. Economic reality had little to do with textbook models, and socialism at the time was seen as a realistic political alternative, something that which at the current crisis doesn't play a role anymore. Okay, so what were the orthodox policy recommendations? What was tried? I said the 1920s is a turbulent period. Everybody wanted to go back to the pre-World War I economic stability, so the classical, so-called classical gold standard in between about 1817 and 1913 was perceived as a time of prosperity and stability, and to this stability everybody wanted to return. Now, to put that back in place, the macroeconomic policies available were on this fiscal side, well, not really there. This is not right. Fiscal policy was characterized by the balanced budget. That was the goal. That's actually, Schumpeter calls it the fundamental article of financial faith. Taxes cannot be used to gauge the economy, but taxes are only a source of revenue. And expenditure, to make that possible and keep taxes as low as possible, expenditure should be, government expenditure, should be only for necessary purposes. So that is fiscal policy at the time. And it's not just 19th century fiscal policy, what you see here. That is actually what was tried in the 1920s as well. In fact, Churchill makes these 3 points here, calls it the Treasury Review on fiscal policy in a speech in 1929. Very importantly, monetary policy, the return to gold. That was seen as a guarantee of stability, and therefore we have to look at the gold standard a bit more in detail. The gold standard is a currency system where you fix the value of your currency in terms of gold. You fix a price of gold, and if you do that, if the Germans fix the Reichsmark in terms of gold, if the British fix the pound in terms of gold, then it's as if you would choose a fixed exchange rate, right? So this fixed exchange rate has advantages, but also disadvantages. What was also seen as an advantage of the system was that there is a kind of automatic stabilizer that, at least in the long run, you reach price stability. And you can explain that with the price-busy flow mechanism put maybe for the first time forward by David Hume in the 18th century. yeah, he, differently from my chain here, he was talking about an example like think about reducing the money stock in an economy back to medieval levels. What's going to happen? Well, prices will go down. If that was England, then England becomes competitive as compared to the rest of Europe. So you will have exports from England flowing to the rest of Europe. These exports will be paid with international currency, which is gold. So gold is flowing into England. And this inflow of gold will lead to an increase in prices. So this price reduction will be reversed. So that's this automatic stabilization of the gold standard. And there is no price stability policy behind that. There's no central bank actively intervening, but this is just a byproduct of the way the gold standard worked. Okay, moreover, you see in reality that whenever countries went off gold, the currency became unconvertible, then these periods were in general characterized by inflation. Extreme example, obviously, the hyperinflation in Germany with a monthly inflation rate of over 300%. So that is why it was seen as a necessary step. We go back to gold to get back to this pre-war stability. There's another point to it, to this so-called gold standard mentality. It's not just stability or the fear of inflation. It is also an ideological point, again made by Schumpeter here. What is left in his view of 19th century economic liberalism in the 1920s is the gold standard. And he is willing to defend that, although as an economist he is of course also aware of the advantages a flexible exchange rate system might have. But this price he is willing to pay to keep this part and parcel of a laissez-faire and free trade economy as it was in the 19th century. So that these two aspects, one aspect is stability, fear of inflation, the other one is this ideological point. Now some empirical facts. How did the economies look like in the 1920s? I said that there was a reduction in flexibility and increasing stickiness of prices and wages. This is from a paper from 1935 by Gardner Means, who plots here the changes, the price changes of the price index of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. These are 750 items about, and you see on the horizontal line you see the number of changes, and on the left-hand side goods which basically did not change in between 1926 and 1933 at all, and on the right-hand side, goods which changed every month, where the price changed every month. So that two types of goods in this economy. One type is, for one type, prices are made on the market, and for the other one, prices are established administratively. And because of the considerable proportion of prices established administratively, there is a call for policy intervention, because Wiens says if prices cannot adjust, then quantities will have to adjust. And this is something economic policy has to cope with. So you have this reduction in price flexibility. Another important point is the view on the business cycle, how economists and economic politicians view the business cycle. A very prominent work here by Barber, Prosperity and Depression, collects all business cycle theories available at this time. And the stylized view of the business cycle you can see here. You have the upper turning point called crisis, the lower turning point called revival. The downturn is a depression, so not a great depression, that's a normal depression, and the upturn, that's a prosperity phase. That's the normal course of the business cycle. The view would be, that's a characteristic of a market economy, and government should not intervene. Now comes the Great Depression. And if you look at these results here from the NBER business cycle chronology, they date business cycles. First two columns are peak and troughs of the cycle. Then you have 4 columns measuring the length of the cycle. What you can see here, the contraction period in between August 29 and March 33 is 43 months. That's the Great Depression, right? 43 months in depression. Just to compare with the decline in the US after December 2007, it was 18 months, so clearly less. So that's the Great Depression. And so something's wrong with the picture of the business cycle, right? If you go back, you ask yourself, where's this automatic recovery, right? 43 months in depression. Economists try to take that into account. And they were talking now, well, there is this depression, this normal depression, that's the primary phase of the downturn. But then it can happen that you enter this red phase here, the secondary depression, and all of a sudden it becomes important that government intervenes, because out of the secondary depression, there is no automatic escape. You need government intervention. Economists looked at what was going on in the 1930s, and they were devastated. I show you 2 examples here. One is John Maynard Keynes, an economist who actively took place in economic debates at the time. So somebody who was into giving economic policy advice. However, here in this lecture, he makes the point there is now no possibility of reaching a normal level of production in the near future. Our efforts are directed towards attainment of more limited hopes. Can we prevent an almost complete collapse of the financial structure of modern capitalism? So he sees the danger of an end of capitalism. With no financial leadership left in the world and profound intellectual error as to causes and cures prevailing in the responsible seats of power, one begins to wonder and doubt. So he is really pessimistic. Other pessimistic view, a German, Wilhelm Röpke, also active in giving economic policy advice, all who have shared the experience of the present author growing up amid the splendor of an easygoing pre-war period, and then he goes on about what was happening in the 1920s. And then they may well come to the conclusion that Dante had witnessed next to nothing. So they were really pessimistic. And since they were kind of also on the practitioner side, one might ask how helpful statements like this were at the period. It's not only economists debating the switch towards a centralized economy, not only economists who debated the end of capitalism, there was also an imminent danger of political instability, and of course Germany is the example here. The quote here is from Hans Luther, the president of the German Central Bank, during the first phase of the Depression, and he points out that after 1931, when the saving of the banks started, the saving of the banking sector started, these policies they met with anti-capitalist attitude of the public, and you can see that also here. If you look at these are voting shares at elections to the Reichstag, 28, 30, and 32, and you see how the extreme left and the extreme right won considerably. So it's not an academic, just an academic debate. There's a real danger, and we know what happened in Germany after 1933. How am I doing on time? Okay. Just a little digression. A lot of policies, of successful policies at the time are sometimes brought in connection with Keynes. I said he was giving policy advice. However, his general theory was not really available when the crisis hit hardest in 1931. The general theory was published in 1936, so couldn't really have an impact before the Second World War. And in fact, Keynes was not very happy about Roosevelt, whom he visited in 1934, tried to give him advice. Roosevelt did not listen, and Keynes stated, I don't think your President Roosevelt knows anything about economics. So the influence was probably not there, and what we know now from textbooks, the textbook representation of the Keynesian model, the ISLM model, was not published before 1937 by Hicks. Taj's textbook, the first Keynesian textbooks, The Elements of Economics, were published in 1947. And then the second element of textbook Keynesianism is this Keynesian cross here, and that was introduced in 1948 by Paul Samuelson. So it was not really time to adapt this. Let me turn now to policy measures which were successful, and I will focus on monetary policy here. A big question is, why did so many economists try to stick to the gold standard at all costs? If you look at the experience, these are GDPs, per capita GDPs, normalized so that 1931 is equal to 100. You have 4 countries here, the United States, UK, France, and Switzerland. And what you can say is that countries which were forced off gold or choose to go off gold recovered quickly. And the example is the UK. They didn't want to leave, they had to leave in 1931. And the UK and the United States, who left in 1932, and you see them recovering quickly. Other countries, France and Switzerland, they were able to stay on gold because they had enough gold reserves, but they paid for it. They paid for that with a prolonged recession. The devaluation is 1936 and took until 1936 for these countries to recover. So the question is, you see this experience, you see what happens in the UK, you see what happens in the US, but still you stick to the gold standard. And the question is, why did they do that? Well, as I said before, the answer to that is this gold standard mentality, fear of inflation, and also this ideological component of the gold standard mentality, sticking to this last bit of economic liberalism left from the 19th century. Okay, US went off gold in 1933, and this was really a decisive move. And Roosevelt was very aware of it, what he did there. Maybe in the discussion we will have time to look at his bombshell message, which is interesting. So this was really something different, a new policy measure. We go off gold, we look at internal balance, and no longer and don't care about fixing the exchange rate. We want to keep prices stable, we want to keep unemployment low. This is the goal of economic policy. No longer exchange rate stability. That's what the US did. What about Germany? Well, Germany, they couldn't really do anything. They are constrained by international contracts, like the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. They were not allowed to make the Reichsmark inconvertible, to go off gold, and therefore they couldn't do anything. In fact, there's a controversy on this point, but I think these constraints were there and were binding. What about other European countries? The UK, we saw that before, they went off gold in September 21, in 1931, but they were forced to. They didn't want to. They were forced to because gold reserves were down. They went back on gold in 1926 at an overvalued pound for unknown reasons. It was a very bad choice, but they just wanted the pre-war parity, and therefore they chose an overvalued pound with the consequence that gold reserves went down. Sweden, UK is an important trading partner, so Sweden had to follow the UK some days later. They didn't want to do that either, but because the trading partner went off gold, they had to do that as well, and tried right afterwards to stabilize the krona again against the pound. But what happened was that the stabilization led to an undervaluation of the krona, which then triggered an export-led recovery of Sweden, but by chance, not by a rational choice. We saw Switzerland. Switzerland is a member of the gold bloc. The Swiss franc is severely overvalued until 1936, and that protected the depression. They had also to follow their trading partner, in this case France, in 1936, and immediately afterwards saw a recovery. So there were decisive moves away from the pre-war economic system, like the abandonment of the gold standard. And I just want to conclude here with this quote by Bernanke. For sure you've seen that over the last 7 to 8 years, very often, like that the Great Depression, understanding the Great Depression is the holy grail of macroeconomics. It is the starting point of modern macroeconomics on the one side, but it also its experience influences the economists' beliefs, policy recommendations, and research agendas. And there's a very interesting recent book by Barry Eichengreen, Hall of Mirrors, and he makes the point that we learned from the Depression in the sense that the financial crisis didn't lead to a depression like in the 1930s. We saw that before, right? When I showed you the duration of the contraction in the 1930s compared with the duration of the contraction following December 2007. So depression, we learned something. We did not fall again into a situation like the Great Depression. However, because politicians were successful in preventing a depression, they could quickly turn back to business as usual. So we can argue about what is going on since 2010 and whether all the policy choices made since that date is really are really recommendable. And Eichengreen makes the point that this has to do that depression was successfully prevented. This was not the case in the 1930s, and in the 1930s one had to look to more rigorous measures than we see now in the follow-up of the financial crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Woitek, for your wonderful and inspiring insights. And may I ask you one question? You just showed the quote from Bernanke, and then you said as well, as part of the financial crisis we had in the last years, we didn't enter in a depression so far. But if you see into the future for the next 10 years, if we have shrinking societies and aging societies, and like Japan, where the GDP is going down, do you see the risk that we run in some kind of economic slowdown, or will it be overcome by types of innovation?
I mean, obviously this goes beyond the question on whether we learned from the Depression, right? This is a different set of problems which are serious, and I think we have to deal with them. Whether the depression prevention toolkit is the right way for this type of problems, I don't think so.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, you mentioned an unemployment rate of 25%. This we can easily imagine today. We even have more in Spain and Greece. And then you mentioned a hyperinflation of 335% monthly. This we can't imagine today. And my question is, what is the explanation for the inflation rate at that time? And when did we recover? And what can we learn from it? Unemployment, I see as a manageable problem, but here, in inflation rate, that is gigantic.
Maybe the unemployment rate I quoted was for the US, right, in the 1930s, and the unemployment rate in the US at the height in the aftermath of the crisis was 10%. Just to put that into perspective, but you are right. There are countries in Europe where the unemployment rate is much higher than 25%. That's right. About the hyperinflation, certainly one of the reasons was the way Germany financed World War I. So again, hyperinflation is a consequence of an economic consequence of World War I. Other than in the UK, the war was mainly debt financed, and this accumulated debt, together with a strange monetary policy accommodating it, led in the end to the hyperinflation. So the Reichsbank printed money in order to finance this debt, and in the end you had the hyperinflation.
Thank you for your talk, but I think the idea that you convey is that this time somehow we got out of it much more quickly than we got out of it in the Great Depression. But I think there are a whole lot of economists and many other people who would suggest that that's a very rosy picture of what's going on, and that we are in effect still in the crisis, and some countries are in a situation which is, you said 25% employment. We can name at least 3 countries in Europe which are in a situation like that. And many people attribute the fact that we are still in that situation to the imposition of austerity policies, which in some sense correspond to the policy reaction after the great crash.
I fully agree. In fact, my point of view, I would agree with Barry Eichengreen saying that at the beginning, the policy measures in the financial crisis were correct, right? And they looked like they were successful. I mean, if you look at pictures, seeing the business cycle indicators, comparing them in the 1930s at the upper turning point of the cycle before it turned down, and compare it with the financial crisis, it looked worse. The financial crisis looked worse. However, it did not, went all the way down. And Eichengreen says, well, this success led us to embark too quickly again, switch back to business as normal, and embark too quickly again to policies like austerity and so on. And that would be my position as well.
There's one question from the youth.
Hi, sorry. I would be interested, maybe this goes beyond your talk, but how did the Bretton Woods system come about? Like maybe you could go on with the history of economics and just say then what happened after World War II.
Well, the Bretton Woods system was basically an attempt to keep parts of the gold standard alive while acknowledging that it can, well, the classic gold standard cannot work anymore. Bretton Woods was like every country was fixing the exchange rate towards the US dollar, and the US dollar was convertible into gold, right? So it's like a gold standard. It's like a gold standard, yes.
By chance, I watched yesterday night documentation from Robert Reich, where he said, if we see the history of inequality of income wages, We had a peak in 1928 and in 2007. And just afterwards, the depressions happened. Can you spend a few words which fact how this played a role in these depressions?
I haven't really thought very much about that, but I would suggest the following, that this reduction in inequality after what you said 1928, 29, this reduction in inequality has certainly to do with policy measures put in place also in reaction to the Great Depression, right? And the longer you move forward in the 20th century, you see that more and more of these policy measures taken back, yeah? And then you have this increase in inequality again. So you get this kind of U shape, and I think the Great Depression has to do with the downturn, and forgetting about the Great Depression has to do with the upturn again. But as I said, just as an idea.
One final question.
Can I add just a little other question, which is that what is interesting to compare is the obsession now with the fact that inflation is too low. And that for Germans, of course, is a real conundrum. And I would just like you to compare what happened to inflation in the major countries after the Great Crash, after the Great Depression, in terms of inflation, and compare that to what's happening now, where we have extremely low inflation.
Well, that's kind of difficult because depression is characterized, running up to the depression is actually characterized with a deflation, a worldwide deflation process, right? So very low inflation rates at the beginning, and then countries, economies like the US frantically trying to get prices up again. So the National Industry Recovery Act I was mentioning was actually a measure put in place to increase prices again. So I think depression is characterized by low inflation rates, and right afterwards, then it becomes difficult because some countries start to prepare for World War II, others, so there is a lot of the other things going on, which I cannot really compare to the current situation, but yeah. It's a puzzle, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Woitek.